This is All India Radio, Power of Listening. Under this series, tonight we take you on a journey to the world of yet another magnificent facet of the traditional Indian knowledge systems. I'm Manoj Mainkar. In today's episode, we shall be focusing on metallurgy in ancient India. The expert on the show is Professor Sharada Srinivasan, Padma Awardee Archaeologist from the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bengaluru. She is known for her specialization in the scientific study of art, archaeology, archaeometallurgy and culture. Stay tuned.
The story of the use of metals and materials is synonymous with that of the march of human civilization. As humans evolved through the Darwinian process of biological evolution of the survival of the fittest and through adaptation, they also experimented progressively with the use and exploitation of metals and materials for the enhancement of their lifestyles. For example, they moved from the use of simple stone tools in the Neolithic period to more complex materials. Humankind moved from the identification and progressively more complex extraction of materials and metals using pyrometallurgical techniques in later periods, and also of alloying or mixing of metals and the extraction based on the availability of resources. Hence, generally speaking, one sees that at different periods in history, one set of materials was predominant to then be replaced by a more advanced material which was better suited to the needs of the times. And that is why the different archaeological and chronological ages are also classified in this basis, following the model of C.J. Thomson, the Danish scientist, in 1836. Accordingly, these were classified as Stone Age, Copper Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age, and so on, based on the complexity of extraction and alloying. And it would be fair to say that we are still in the Steel Age, where the use of steel for construction and so on predominates, although the idea of a Silicon Age also has resonance, which is widely in use and is a very integral part of our information age. The early metals to be exploited, thus, were those which were found in the elemental or native state, followed by those which were found as combined ores and based on the ease with which the metals could be reduced from the ores, which may have been in the oxidized state and so on. And those metals which were more difficult to extract from the ores were tended to be discovered last. Many modern developments in metallurgy draw from ancient practices that predate the Industrial Revolution. It is interesting that in antiquity and before the Industrial Revolution, less than about 10 metals were used widely. And different parts of the world have contributed to this progression in different and unique ways, including India. For example, the noble metal of platinum, which was found in the native or unalloyed state, was used widely only in South American antiquity by the Incas and so on. The commonly used metals in the Old World include copper, gold, silver, lead, tin, iron, and mercury. Zinc was added to this list at least by the medieval period, and in fact, it was India which pioneered the large-scale extraction of metallic zinc, as seen in the evidence in Zawar in Rajasthan, which I will discuss later. But after the Industrial Revolution in the 18th-19th centuries in Western Europe, the discovery and use of metals and materials rose exponentially, and today there are more than 90 metals which are more widely recognized and used. Cyril Stanley Smith wrote a memorable essay on the 4 great metallurgical researches in antiquity, which included woods or Damascus steel made particularly in southern India, which I will discuss later. And in a similar fashion, I will try to highlight some significant aspects of Indian metallurgical heritage, particularly from southern India, which I have been involved with. Cyril Stanley Smith is widely regarded as the father of the discipline of archaeometallurgy, which I work in. Now, copper is a metal which is found both in the native or elemental state and also in the form of ores and oxidized or corroded compounds. And the earliest use of copper, which would have been in the native state as nuggets, seems to be as early as about the 8th millennium BCE in Turkey, or what was known as Anatolia. The early use of copper is also seen in a pre-Harappan context from Mehergarh in Baluchistan by about the 4th millennium BCE. The use of various non-ferrous metals is seen in the full-blown river valley civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and also the Indus Valley civilization of the Indian subcontinent circa 2500 BCE, which are referred to as Bronze Age civilizations. Copper by itself is a soft metal, and the alloying of elements such as tin hardens it to make tools and such like, and this is referred to as bronze. Well, of course, the most dazzling of all metals is gold, which is also been popular throughout the centuries and particularly in India for the use of jewelry and so on. The noble metal of gold is found in nature in the native state. Gold has been sought after for jewelry not only due to its golden luster, but due to its great ductility, which facilitated the forging of it into sheet metal and a range of shapes. The most spectacular ancient gold artifact is, of course, the Egyptian enigmatic mask of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun, circa 1300 BC, made by hammering sheet metal. While rich gold finds are also known from the burials of the 5th millennium BC from Bulgaria. Early gold and silver ornaments from the Indian subcontinent are found from Indus Valley and Harappan sites, such as Mohenjo-daro, circa 3000 BC, and Dholavira, and so on. Gold can be found as nuggets in the hard rock veins and ores. Gold can also be recovered as alluvial gold, where the heavier gold particles are washed down from the tops of the mountains by the streams to the lower levels. And it is also recovered in antiquity in this form as alluvial gold quite often. The Rig Veda, composed around 1500 BC, refers to gold in various ways as metaphors such as the Hiranya Garbha or the golden womb, and also with respect to rivers. There is also a curious reference of the Greek Herodotus of the mid-1st millennium BC, who mentions the gold-digging ants in the Persian regions of India, i.e. the northwestern part of India, which may be referred to alluvial gold. And we do know that alluvial gold is found in the rivers of the region such as the Indus or the Sindhu. However, apart from alluvial gold, gold could also be extracted from hard rock mines and veins. And in fact, from the Hatti-Maski region of Karnataka and southern India, there are intriguing carbon dates from old mines going back to about the 4th century BC at a depth of 200 meter, which seem to be the deepest old gold mines known in antiquity, which had been identified by the Hatti gold mines. And it's also interesting because this also suggests that the mining in this region had been going on much longer than that, because these are at a depth, and the surface mining would have gone back at least to about perhaps a few centuries earlier. Now, the Ashokan edicts also refer to the Maski region as Suvarna Bhumi, which may refer to the local gold. Some of the very early intact finds of gold jewelry is from the Nilgiri cairns of Tamil Nadu in the lush Nilgiri hills, and these include earrings and pendants in floral motifs, while there are also old workings found in the auriferous quartz veins in the Nilgiris, where the tribal communities such as the Kurumbas were undertaking panning for gold from the streams. Until recently, the gold was collected in pans, where the lighter particles are washed away in the stream and the heavier gold collects in the sediments in the pan. And Sangam Tamil literature of the early historic period also refers to gold merchants and so on. Coming to the copper-bronze repertoire, of course, the use of copper-bronze tools is seen from Harappan times, including utilitarian artifacts such as chisels, maybe even drills. And several examples of copper alloyed with a small amount of tin are known to have been made of bronze, and these include the fine miniature bronze of the celebrated Mohenjo-daro dancing girl circa 2500 BC, which is about 10 centimeters in height, which is one of the best known such examples, where a lot has been packed into the tiny frame, such as the armful of bangles similar to nomadic communities such as the Rabaris of Western India and the Lambaris of Southern India. Cast in the round, it is very likely to have been made of the lost wax casting process, where a model would have been made of wax and then it would have been covered in clay to make the mold and heated so the wax was expelled and metal is poured into the mold. And significant new finds of about the Chalcolithic period are also now found from Sanauli in Uttar Pradesh, dated to about 2000 BCE, where we find not only copper Antennae swords, but also evidence for a chariot burial with copper cladding. And of course, there are also broader ramifications with finds such as of chariot burials in Northern Europe and other parts of the world, which need to be explored further. But the making of small figurines by the lost wax process is also interesting because the lost wax casting techniques have still been followed over generations to make statuaries and icons, statuary bronzes, or the Utsava Murti for temple worship, as seen in Swamimalai in Tamil Nadu in southern India. And spectacular bronzes were also cast under the 10th, 11th century Cholas of Tamil Nadu and around the Tanjavur area. However, excellent examples of Gupta statuary are also known, such as the life-size Sultanganj Buddha, now in the Birmingham Museum, which was found to be predominantly of copper and standing over 2 meters. And this is in fact the largest and most spectacular casting from the Indian subcontinent of the 6th century late Gupta period. And this standing Buddha is what we described as a hollow cast bronze because the final casting consisted of a thin layer of metal on an inner core. And this was also a popular technique for making bronze figurines, very large bronze figurines in the Hellenistic and Greek world, and suggests some connections in terms of the technologies coming from the northwestern part of India, which also saw the incursions of Alexander and so on. And it's interesting also that this technique of lost wax casting is also described in the artistic treatises and the Shilpa Shastra, and the texts such as Manasara of the 5th century describes Madhu Chahiste Vidhanam in Sanskrit, which describes lost wax casting process where Madhu refers to the beeswax which is used to make the icon, and then the metal is poured into the mold to take the shape of the hollow. And thus the image is then retrieved from the broken mold. And one of the best known images from the Indian subcontinent is, of course, the celebrated 10th century Nataraja bronze of the Chola period, which depicts the Hindu god Shiva balancing the forces of creation and destruction with the drum of creation in one hand and the fire of destruction in the other hand, and surrounded by the Prabhavali of the ring of fire, depicting metaphorically perhaps the cycles of creation and destruction as suggested by Ananda Kumaraswamy from his translations of the 13th century Tamil Shaiva Siddhanta text of the Unmai Vilakam. And he also went on to hail this bronze as poetry but nonetheless science. And the Nataraja bronze also fired the imagination of the great master sculptor Auguste Rodin, who also described it as une chose divinement réglée, or something divinely ordained. And my researches from the analysis of these bronzes have shown that these are large solid castings made of leaded bronze, where the lead was also made to added to the copper alloy to make it more easy to cast. And the lost wax process is also invoked in a poem by the Tamil woman poet Saint Andal, circa 800 CE, who compares the dark rain clouds to the mold holding liquid wax. And she entreats the rain clouds to rain on the Lord Vishnu. And that actually is a good metaphor because she describes Meligu Uriki Vengalamutru, which is basically the process of melting the wax and pouring Vengalam, which is the word for bronze, and she's talking about the lost wax process in very metaphorical sense. And of course, these practices have been carried on in various parts of southern India through the communities of metal workers known as the Kamalar and the Vishwakarma, and they are still continuing traditions. And the use of bronzes of different proportions and so on are also discussed in treatises such as the Arthashastra in the 3rd century BC, which talks about kamsya, which is similar to the term for bronze, which is also still in vogue in several parts of India. Well, before I move away from the topic of the non-ferrous metals, let me also touch upon zinc. Zinc was, in fact, one of the metals used widely in antiquity to be extracted quite late, because zinc is one of the most difficult of metals to isolate, since the zinc metal oxidizes and volatilizes at around the same temperature of 1000 degrees centigrade, which is the temperature also needed to smelt the zinc ore, and hence it tends to form as a vapor and get lost. But the earliest firm evidence for pre-industrial extraction of metallic zinc seems to come from India, at least in a more widespread way. And the 12th century remains of zinc retorts are found in the area of Zawar in Rajasthan in the Aravalli Hills. And here it is found that the retorts and the remnants of the furnace suggest that the zinc was smelted by the downward distillation of the zinc vapor. So they had managed to condense the zinc vapor through this technique of downward distillation and then get it to solidify and then be able to extract the metallic zinc. And it's interesting also that the Rasa Ratnakara, a Sanskrit text, also describes the process of downward distillation or Tiryak Patana, as does the Rasaratna Samuchaya, which is a 12th century text. And it's also been mentioned that the scientist Nagarjuna also seems to talk about some of these processes related to downward distillation, and which could have also been used in the extraction of rasa, which can also mean mercury, or it can also mean zinc, and so on. So this, in fact, the site of Zawar and the zinc smelting evidence and so on has then been accorded an ASM metallurgical landmark because of its significance in terms of the world production of this metal. In fact, right until the Mughal era of 17th century, it is thought that the Zawar mines were continuing to function under Rajput rulers and up to the 17th century. And some very early examples of brass have also been identified, such as from the Buddhist site of Taxila or Takshashila, now in Pakistan, of about 4th century BC. And in fact, I was able to analyze a Deccan zinc ingot with a Brahmi inscription, Deccan Brahmi inscription, which was attributed to the 5th century from the Andhra region, which was also shaped like a solidified globule, because that is how it is actually formed in the distillation retort when the zinc vapor condenses and forms as droplets. Well, one should also mention that in Europe, the commercial zinc smelting operations were established by William Campion in Bristol, in Britain, in the 1740s, using the downward distillation technique. And evidence to suggest that it drew its inspiration from the Zawar process. And so the Indian metallurgists can justifiably be regarded as inventors of the process of zinc smelting. And of course, the use of high zinc alloy is also made in a very innovative way in the Bidri metalware, which contains largely zinc with some copper. And this was developed under the Bahmani sultans in the Bidar region of Karnataka around 14th century. And then the Bidri ware was also inlaid with silver and so on and patinated, and that also came widely into vogue in the late medieval period, which was also a very remarkable innovation. Well, moving away from the non-ferrous metals to the ferrous metals, of course, the Indian subcontinent also has a very vibrant antiquity when it comes to iron and steel. And the celebrated Delhi iron pillar is renowned as a rustless wonder for its relative corrosion resistance. Standing at about 7 meters high, it is the earliest surviving massive iron forging in the world. And it has a prominent Sanskrit Brahmi inscription on the pillar, dated to about 400 CE, which is attributed to the Gupta king Chandragupta II, alluding to the erection of a dhwaja or pillar by Chandra, who was also a devotee of the Hindu deity Vishnu, because there is a mention of the hill of Vishnu Padagiri and so on. And the Delhi iron pillar was also one of the first objects to be studied from a scientific perspective by Sir Robert Hadfield, and it was found to be an iron of very high purity with about 0.1% phosphorus and 0.04% carbon, which is what we describe as wrought iron, because wrought iron has very little carbon, of about less than about 0.04% carbon. Now, of course, the use of iron is also something which had a fair degree of antiquity in the Indian subcontinent, and more recent finds, for example, from Mailadumparai in Tamil Nadu have recently been carbon dated at Beta Analytics and so on, a very lab in Florida, and found to be giving dates of about the early second millennium BC. And this is at the transition of the Neolithic to Iron Age, because in southern India, of course, there was more of the Iron Age, and that seems to come into vogue from the Neolithic to the Iron Age and so on. Although, of course, there are some copper bronze finds, but it is the widespread use of iron is that is seen associated with the megalithic cultures and so on. And of course, the Rig Veda also makes a mention of the term Ayas, which is also cognate with the Indo-European or Indo-Germanic term Eisen, which is a term for iron. And certainly by about that period of about the mid-second millennium BC, iron was being widely used in many different cultures across the world and also in India. And coming back to the Delhi Iron Pillar, of course, which has been very famous for being very corrosion resistant, ultrasound investigations had also been found to show that it was made by forge welding of cakes of wrought iron. And of course, even to this day, the manufacture of wrought iron and so on is still done in shaft furnaces by tribal communities such as the Agaria and so on in central India. And it is thought that it is due to this let's say, the more primitive tradition of smelting iron that ensures the enriching of a certain content of phosphorus, which then contributes to the corrosion resistance of this iron, and also the very laborious and expert forge welding also, which leads to even distribution of slag and so on. The forge welding technique also results in contribution to the corrosion resistance and the formation of this protective passive film on the surface and so on, though there are, of course, several aspects to still be studied in all of this. But what is also less known is that India has also been famed for the legendary Indian wood steel, or ukku as it is known in South Indian languages, which is a high-grade, high-carbon steel, especially produced in various parts of southern India, including Karnataka, Telangana, and Tamil Nadu, and so on. And according to European travelers' accounts, especially from the 16th to 17th centuries onwards, for example, Tavernier talks of tens of thousands of shipments of wood steel, which were sent from the kingdom of Golconda to Persia and West Asia to make the fabled Damascus blades. And these Damascus blades, which were very sought after, as I said, in the Persian and Arab world and so on, were found to have been forged from this particular type of steel, which is known as the Indian wood steel. And this steel had a high carbon content of typically 1.5 to 2%. And it was the forging of this wood steel which was responsible for the very high cutting edge. And woods is also known to have had some properties which we call those associated with advanced materials, because it also shows properties of superplasticity or high forgeability at high temperatures. And of course, the forging of this steel followed by etching also resulted in this very exotic pattern of alternating dark pearlite and light cementite, which are phases of this high carbon steel. And it was this patterning which was also very beautiful and much sought after in the making of such swords. And we find several such swords also in the Rajput armory and the Mughal armory and the Nizam's armory and so on around India, and Tipu's armory and such like the Tanjore armory. And it's interesting that the attempts to characterize woods by scientists of the caliber of Michael Faraday actually spurred many developments in 19th century metallurgy and contributed to the Industrial Revolution. And it also contributed significantly to Michael Faraday's own work on alloy steels, because he was trying to understand exactly what gave the unique properties to this wood steel. And vast amounts of archaeometallurgical debris related to the production of wood steel are found still in the region of northern Telangana. And typically, the steel was made by packing wrought iron with carbonaceous materials inside crucibles and then firing them for long firing cycles so that the carbon got into the wrought iron to give this high-grade steel. So this steel is also known as crucible steel, and there is a lot of crucible debris, which is broken crucible debris, which is found in sites, for instance, in Tamil Nadu, which I've identified, Melchirvallur and Tiruvannamalai and Chengam and so on. And it is also interesting that the word ukku itself is derived from the Tamil word urukku, which relates to the melting or the process of making molten. And as I mentioned, Andal also talks about meligu urukku, which is to melt the wax. And in this case, urukku is referred to the process of heating the wrought iron to the point where it becomes almost semi-viscous and approaches the molten state, and in that process it is able to absorb more of the carbon, and this increase in the carbon content is what gives this high-grade steel of about 1.2% carbon, and then the forging of that metal gives a very strong alloy. And of course there is also the accounts from the crusades which took place between England and Egypt, between the King Richard and Sultan Saladin, where Sultan Saladin is said to have used his sword blade of Damascus steel with the meandering lines, which Sir Walter Scott also describes in a fictionalized account. And Sultan Saladin is said to have sliced a handkerchief with the blade of wood steel, which points to the very sophisticated and high qualities of this wood steel, which had so much of renown in the ancient world. And the bardic poems of the Tamil Sangam poetess such as Avayar also evoke the war, the sparring chieftains and all that, using the spears, which were described as egu, which is also a term that seems to derive from the term ukku. Well, another instance of the transfer of technology and innovation in terms of contributions to modern science and technology, which one must mention also in the context of the old Mysore state, is the ferrous metal case rockets, which came to be particularly well known in the 18th century when they were used in the Battle of Poliur by Tipu Sultan against the British and caused a lot of panic amongst them. And these rockets were also quite extraordinary for their time. And after the fall of Tipu in 1799 in the Battle of Seringapatam, these were taken to Britain to various armory museums and then studied by William Congreve. It was William Congreve who was inspired to make rockets which were inspired by the design of these Mysorean rockets. And hence they played a very direct role in terms of modern scientific innovation and rocket and space technology, for which now Bangalore is also famous. But I should mention that we had also analyzed some of the rockets which had been found in a huge cache from Nagara in an old well. A lot of the metal casings were actually found, and we had analyzed that, which are now, of course, in the Shivappa Nayaka Museum. And these were found to be of very well forged mild steel. So there were all these different ways in which technology had been adapted to various utilitarian needs. And I should also touch upon a very rare surviving craft tradition, which is the making of reflective metal mirrors, which still survives as a rare artisanal tradition in the village of Aranmula in Kerala. And my studies have shown that these were made of a very unique composition of a very highly reflective bronze. Now, when we think of a metal mirror, the main property that we need is for it to be reflective. Of course, silver is a very reflective metal, but it is very soft and it gets dented, so it's not a very suitable metal for a mirror. But these craftspeople had been able to isolate a bronze of a particular composition of 32% tin, and this delta bronze, actually, it's an intermetallic compound, and the polishing of this metal results in a very hard, silvery and reflective alloy, which has perhaps the best reflectance, which can be described as a front-facing mirror and so on, which gives really one of the best mirror effects that you can get. And of course, the word kannadi also in Tamil means mirror, and kannu adi, or where the eye falls, or what the eye sees. And so this is also a surviving tradition where very low-tech technology had been used to make a very skilled end product, which is also used in ritual and various other ritual and functional needs. And of course, we also know the famous sculpture from the Hoysala temple of Belur of the maiden holding the mirror, the Madanika. And you can see there a correlation with the kind of mirror that was being made in these traditional craft practices. And this sculpture is, of course, of the 12th century. It's a very famous bracket figure and Belur of the Darpanika or Madanika looking into the mirror. Well, of course, sadly, many of the surviving craft traditions linked to age-old practices are rapidly declining, with the livelihoods getting increasingly marginalized. And hence, we need to really try and retrieve the remnants of this rich pre-industrial legacy and also document it better for our contemporary understanding. And the area of conservation research is also one that needs more impetus. And even the Delhi Iron Pillar, for example, though it's been hailed as a rustless wonder, in recent times with the industrial pollution and so on, there needs to be more concerted efforts to try and look at the factors of corrosion and so on, looking into the long term. And there are also still very interesting aspects to be studied and understood. For example, I talked about the high zinc alloy Bidri ware, and although there have been several studies made, we still don't fully understand the patination and the mechanisms of the patination resulting in the coloration. So, and these kinds of studies, of course, also enhance our contemporary understanding, because as I was talking about the Aranmula metal mirror, the use of intermetallic compounds is also something which has a place in our contemporary and modern jargon in terms of technology. So there are these bridges between the traditional and modern that can be made. And the engagement with traditional materials and technologies also enhances our understanding of modern technology, which is another reason, of course, to keep studying them. And finally, of course, it is always, the fascination of the aesthetics and the efforts which have gone, over centuries, which tells the story of human development and the trajectory of human impulses and cognition and so on, which is a very important resource to draw on also in terms of our educational understanding, and the engagement also between the sciences and the arts and the ways in which different disciplines can enrich each other and give us a more holistic understanding is another very important dimension. And it's also interesting to also look back on some of the textual sources which have documented to some extent some of these aspects in our own traditions and the knowledge that they encapsulated, and to carry forward the documentation so that future generations can also draw upon these resources in diverse ways. So thank you very much for your kind attention, and I will take my leave there. Thank you.
Metallurgy in Ancient India. You heard the 50th and the last episode of our series on traditional Indian knowledge systems, Power of Listening. The expert on the show was Professor Sharada Srinivasan, Padma Awardee Archaeologist from the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bengaluru. Professor Srinivasan is known for her specialization in the scientific study of art, archaeology, archaeometallurgy, and culture. We hope you enjoyed it. This episode was produced by Vinod Kumar and Nawaz Ahmad Nengroo. Special thanks to AIR Bengaluru and Randheer Thakur for their contributions. All the episodes of the special series Power of Listening are available on our official YouTube channel, Akashvani AIR. This is Manoj Mainkar signing off from Delhi. Goodbye.